Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our discussion of the major effects of European exploration, right? We are now discussing the massive effects of European exploration of the 1500s into the 1600s and then even catapulting itself into the 1700s later on, how it's going to affect not only society but also economics and all these other stuffs, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is we only got to talk about one thing today in class due to the fact that we had really, really short classes and stuff like that. Typically, we would have been able to go a little bit further, but it's okay because, like, explaining the Columbian Exchange in a way that you're going to understand it is very, very important to your understanding of the entirety of European exploration and all of its major effects and stuff like that. Now, the Columbian Exchange, though, it's very important that we put one little word nearby it real quick, okay? So go ahead next to Columbian Exchange or underneath your definition what actually should say something along the lines of the exchange of goods from either side of the world, blah, 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 blah. The thing that you also need to include in there, though, is it was informal, okay? Informal, I-N-F-O-R-M-A-L, which means it was on accident, right? It wasn't on purpose, it wasn't deliberate. Kind of like when Mr. Terry throws the football and, like, hits Keely Edgerton in the hands, but then Keely doesn't catch it. You know what I'm talking about? It's informal. It was an accident or whatever. So the thing about it, though, is that the Columbian Exchange, regardless of it being informal or formal, or regardless that a major component of the Columbian Exchange is also the spread of disease, it's going to lead to the difference in economics and how people existed in society. And what I'm getting at by that is economics are going to drastically change, right? So before the Columbian Exchange, Europeans lived in what was known as subsistence economics, okay? Subsistence economics. Subsistence economic patterns hinge upon the idea that you make just enough to survive, right? Now, what is this going to probably cause in places in Europe, right? Feudalism is not going to always produce as much food as you need it to, and a lot of crazy things are going to happen. So subsistence economics, though, can be really chaotic and can actually lead to periods of famine, to periods of drought, and to periods of like war and, well, not war, but like periods, or actually, yeah, war, actually, as well in other parts and other times. But the big thing about it to understand is that these subsistence-style economic systems are not going to be actually hinging upon the idea of surpluses, right? They're actually going to lead to people having massive effects and go through periods of famine and stuff like that. Whereas now the Columbian Exchange is providing a massive amount of luxury items, novelties, if you will, right? For example, the Columbian Exchange is now bringing in heap loads of tea from Asia. It's bringing in heap loads of chocolate from North America. And so it's now leading to a concept known as consumerism, right? This isn't one of those words that if I could teach an economics 101 class at Chappelle, I totally would. Consumerism is the concept, though, that you have enough money in your pocket to go off and buy things that you may or may not necessarily need, right? So, for example, there was a story about a woman in England who apparently had never seen tea before. A woman from England who had never seen tea before when this entire Columbian Exchange thing began and the effects of exploration actually really got off to a huge start. Well, the thing about it is, though, is since she had never seen tea before, she actually baked it into a pie because she didn't really know what to do with it, right? So that's an element of consumerism that over time, as these goods become more of a normal thing in society, you're going to see the growth of consumer economics. So people can buy hot chocolate. They can buy goods from North and South America. They can buy things coming over like a watermelon that they've never tried before, or a pineapple and stuff like that. Fun fact, John Smith, the guy from Pocahontas, right? So the real John Smith, though, actually burned his leg off, not off, but burned his leg up and stuff like that. Never actually got to go back to the Jamestown colony. He actually was the one that named pineapples. We actually attribute it to that because he didn't know what it was. He's like, looks like it's kind of like a pine cone. Maybe it's pineapple. So now the thing about it, though, in general, is we're going to have other key effects as well, right? One of those things being inflation, okay? So now, there's a big difference, though. What inflation is your general rise in prices due to the availability of cash in a society. Now, inflation is a normal thing, right? Inflation happens normally. It does occur in society. If you ask your parents how much things cost when they were little, it's going to be very different from the way it costs now. And over time, it was even different. We are dealing with a spike in inflation right now, but the thing about it, though, is inflation occurs over time no matter what. If I remember when I used to ask my grandma, I'd be like, Nanny, how much was candy when you were little? And she used to tell me all the time that there was a big barrel of penny candy when she was a kid. And you used to be able to take a penny in there and you put you give the teller a penny and you could have 5 or 6 pieces of this penny candy from this big barrel and stuff like that. You go anywhere now, ain't nothing going to be able to, a penny's not going to buy you anything because that's just natural inflation, right? But there is a huge difference, though, between inflation and this thing called hyperinflation. Do me a favor, jot that word down, hyperinflation. That's when there's a massive uptick in inflation due to the fact that there's been an overwhelming injection of cash into a society, okay? And or the production of cash that has no backing, okay? So it can be one of two things. But we're going to talk about it a little bit more, and especially in the next unit. I just need you to know what that word hyperinflation means for right now. So now going into it, though, as well, we got other key effects, including, for example, supply and demand economics. That's going to be a massive thing that happens during this time period as well. Supply and demand economics is going to actually be able to create, or is going to be a hinge or part of this consumerism aspect, right? In subsistence economics, you don't have supply and demand because supply and demand actually works off the idea that you're buying a thing that you do not necessarily need, all right? Now, supply and demand does happen in subsistence economics, just not as often, right? For example, wheat prices can be affected, changing the price of bread due to the amount of wheat that's being grown, right? So, however, subsistence or supply and demand economics really hinge on consumer products more than anything else. For example, you're seeing the issue of supply and demand right now with eggs in the market, right? Eggs are right now like $8 a carton due to the fact that there's a low supply of these eggs, right? There's a supply chain issue and stuff like that. So what's happening is since the supply is down, the demand is up, right? So that's going to lead to an increase in prices. For example, also, if the supply is up and it's very big, the demand is down, which means that prices will come down on that item, right? So supply and demand economics are going to be another major effect of this as well. And the other big thing about it, though, as well, that you need to put a star next to, is going to be the increased power of royals and monarchs, okay? So something to keep in the back of your mind as we're going into our next unit in a little while. You need to understand that the royals, the monarchs, the kings and queens of these other areas took a major gamble on these exploration things. For example, Isabella and Ferdinand are the people that gave Columbus the money and goods to go off to the Americas and try to, well, not to go off to the Americas, to try and find a route to get to India to get into that spice trade, right? Well, they made a big gamble and they said go find and do it, but then they ended up discovering two brand new continents, right? Well, so well, not brand new, the Native Americans knew they were there, but the big thing about it, though, in general, is that that's going to lead to the increase in power due to the increase in funds to royals and monarchs. People like Henry VIII are going to try and lead some colonization attempts, but they're not going to go very well because the very first successful one doesn't happen until his family's already dead, right? So, but the thing about it that you need to understand is that royals and monarchs' power is going to increase as exploration and as colonization increases as well. Now, keeping it on to this entire idea and keeping the understanding in this, you have to understand also that there's a massive global market that's growing, okay? So the thing about it, though, is when you were little, you learned about this global market like this, right? You talked about it when you were younger and in elementary school and stuff like that. There are even some AP textbooks that still call it this, but I refuse to call it this anymore because I think it's dumb and it's not how anything actually works, right? This right here, though, you sometimes referred to when you were little, 4th, 5th grade, 3rd grade, as the triangle trade, right? Your teacher got up in front and they drew the big triangle on the map and they were like, goods from Europe, like processed textiles, went to Africa in exchange for slaves that went to the Americas. That in exchange went for that helped produce plantation products like sugar and tobacco and cotton and sent it to Europe. And then the whole cycle started over again. That's too simple. You are a grown-up now. You are now in a historiography class. We're not going to sit here and be like, the triangle trade, all right? It actually should be called more the transatlantic trade network, okay? So I want you to write that down real quick. The transatlantic trade network, okay? Say that again with me really quick. The transatlantic trade network. Because it actually looked much more like this. Look at how these arrows are going everywhere. You got manufactured goods going back to the colonies. You got raw products going into Europe. You got things from Africa going into Europe as well. And then you also got these other directions. And the arrows are actually going everywhere. They're not just going here to there to there. This is not Candyland. You are a grown-up now. You can understand that what is actually going on is there's a massive trade network that spans the Atlantic Ocean, and there are even products coming from over here out in Asia, including spices and goods from Southeast Asia as well. So this is actually much more of a transatlantic trade network, right? Regional goods do include Europe being the place where a lot of processed goods are coming from because the proto factories and stuff were there. You've got Americas, which are producing a lot of raw materials and plantation products. And then you also have Africa, which is actually going to be having a lot of gold, ivory, other goods coming out of there, and then also slaves were being taken from their homes and being put into the slave trade network. Now, a lot of this began under the rule of the Portuguese, and we do need to make sure that we understand that the slave trade network is actually not going to have a major boom until the mid-1600s, okay? So when we're looking back in time, looking at all the stuff that involves Spain and the Spanish and Cortez and Pizarro and people like that, Pizarro's conquest of the Inca when he captured Atahualpa at the Battle of Cajamarca didn't happen until 1532, right? So in 1532, that's when that actually event occurred, and the Spanish are going to take over the Inca. The Aztecs are going to get taken over by Cortez and his men, and then also, of course, an army of natives and stuff like that in 1519, right? So in 1519, 1532, you're talking about the mid-1500s, right? The North Atlantic slave trade did not actually boom until the mid-1600s. That's 100 years later. Now, why is this, right? Because remember, you're adults now. We can talk about this in more of a historiographic way, okay? So the reason why is because for that 100 years, from about the mid-1500s, as there was the establishment of plantations, gold and silver mines in South America, Central America, and also slightly in North America as well. Well, Central America is part of North America, so you know what I mean. But the thing about it is they used that system known as the encomienda system, right? Where they forced the natives that did not die of starvation, malfeasance, butchering, genocide, and or disease. They used them in a system of forced labor to make them be the ones who farmed sugarcane, farm goods like coffee or like other like things as well, and or be the people that also went down into the mines and harvested gold and silver. Well, as the encomienda system rolled forward, it's going to end up leading to the further death and destruction of native societies. People will die from overexhaustion, from overexertion, from exposure, and then also from disease and other injuries as well. Now, as the native populations began to die off and then also mix with the European colonists, because most of your Spanish colonists were single men, you have to understand that is when the slaves will be brought in from Africa to replace the dying labor of the natives, right? So as the things went further forward, by the mid-1600s, plantation economics and the failing encomienda system is going to lead to the massive uptick in the thievery, the robbery, and the taking of African people from the west coast of Africa to the Americas in the form of slavery, right? So slaves were brought in massive numbers, okay? Something that we need to understand, massive numbers from the western coast of Africa, primarily by the Portuguese when their Indian spice trade began to kind of die off, right? Oftentimes, slaves would be brought in on boats known as floating coffins and stuff like that because they were being brought at a number of 500 people at once. Now, this is kind of a blurry image and stuff like that, but all of these little lines right here are human beings that are being transported on a slave vessel. 500 people at once, and the reason why they're in small lines is because they're actually laying down. You have to understand that the conditions on these boats were absolutely disgusting, right? Absolutely disgusting. They weren't allowed to move. They weren't allowed to get up. They weren't allowed to use the bathroom efficiently. Disease ran rampant and spread on them very, very often. And sometimes 50% of people that were being actually taken on these boats could sometimes end up dying. According to some reports, some women would apparently have children on these boats, and then they would actually purposefully kill the child so the child would not have to spend their life in slavery, right? And then also oftentimes the mother would die in the childbirthing process as well. So the thing about it is that these floating coffins where they were being brought over from Africa were absolutely disgusting, and this entire area is known as the Middle Passage, right? So go ahead and write that down. The Middle Passage was the journey that slaves took from the western coast of Africa all the way over to the Americas. Now, it's important to also note something as well. A lot of people will talk about, and then they ended up coming to North America primarily and what is now the United States. That's actually not true. Upwards of 90% of the slaves that were brought in via the West African slave trade actually went to the Caribbean or to Brazil. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was the Portuguese traders, and Brazil belonged to the Portuguese. And also because most of them were being brought over originally to grow sugarcane on the sugar islands and things like that. But the thing about it in general is also something that's very important to understand is how these slaves got there, how they were, their movement, and how this is an absolute atrocity in history that we treated human beings in this way. Because 12.5 million men, women, and children made it to the Americas on these slave vessels. And the thing about it is 2 million of them are believed to have died en route. So actually only 10.5 million men, women, and children made it to the Americas alive, right? So 2 million people died. 6 million Jewish people died in the Holocaust. Those numbers are not that far apart. We're talking about in the millions of people here, right? So going forward even further as well, you have to understand as well that as this is going on in the Western Hemisphere, we're seeing massive effects of market economics go on in the Eastern Hemisphere too, okay? So you've got the effects of the commercial revolution, and you got the rise of the companies going on in the eastern half of the world, okay? So the last that we heard anything about any of these, the growth mindset or any of these ideas about economics and the birth of large-scale economics in the Eastern Hemisphere, a lot of it had to do with the Portuguese who were in India reaping off the spice trade and the Dutch who were in the Spice Islands, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to actually cut it right there, and we're going to pick up on some other ideas in class, and then we're also going to start the scientific revolution, which I'm very excited to start with you guys tomorrow, okay? We'll talk about all this stuff that we talked about in this flip. Nice little short flip. See y'all tomorrow. Y'all have a good one.